All right, it's the top of the hour, so we'll get going here. Welcome, everyone, to our regular webinar series. I'm so glad that you could join us. My name is James Okulo. I'm the Director of System Planning at ESIG, which is a member-based nonprofit organization committed to providing our members with objective information, resources, and networking opportunities. And we do this in a number of ways. We do this through our workshops, our tutorials, these webinars like you're on today, blogs, working groups, task forces, and we produce a number of technical resource materials, which are all accessible on our website. Our workshops, our webinars are open to everyone, so feel free to register anytime on the ESIG website. Now, if you're new to ESIG, I strongly encourage you to follow up with us. You can find us on the web at www.esig.energy, as well as on LinkedIn, Facebook, and on X, formerly known as Twitter. So before we begin, let's go over some logistics. So please note that the participant lines will be muted during the webinar, and this is just to limit any unnecessary distractions. For Q&A, we'll be using slido.com. That is slido.com. And we'll provide that on the opening page as well. So please go to slido.com and enter ESIG 9, ESIG 9 as the event code. The instructions are also at the bottom of the screen. In addition, you'll see a thumbs up button next to the questions to allow you to cast a vote to help set the priorities for the questions submitted. And if you feel so inclined, include your name. I know Slido allows you to ask questions anonymously, but if you'd like to include your name, that helps us follow up with you as well. We plan to reserve 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A at the end and then conclude at the top of the hour. After we're done with the webinar in a couple of days, we'll follow up with an email link once the video file has been posted. We'll also send short responses to any unanswered questions after the webinar. So please don't be afraid to ask your questions through Slido, as many as there are. So jumping right into the topic, stress testing methods for evaluating resilience to extreme events, valuing interregional transmission. And of course, that's a two-part topic. One is looking at the stress testing itself, and two is looking at the value of interregional transmission. And so we all know that the grid operates as one highly interconnected machine. We rely on neighbors every day, and that's especially true when conditions get tight, as we've seen in the last few weeks here. But when we plan for the future, we often don't fully treat it that way. Reliability studies and planning processes still tend to stay inside individual utilities and ISO boundaries, even though we know that the risks we're seeing do not. And that gap matters now more than it used to. The grid is changing quickly with load growth, electrification, and major resource shifts, all in the face of increasingly frequent extreme weather. It seems like every year we have one of these events. And the high impact events like winter storms and heat domes are a clear reminder that these tail risks are becoming central, not as rare as they were before, and that we need to develop more rigorous stress testing to understand how the system performs under all these conditions. A key theme in the report that we'll be talking about today discusses the current planning can underestimate resilience risk by not fully accounting for the availability and value of interregional transmission. In real world extreme events, transfers of available external resources have helped mitigate the impacts, which is a strong signal that interregional transmission carries meaningful resilience value. Recognizing that value is a necessary step if we want to move from ad hoc reliance in real time to coordinated efforts to expand transfer capability and strengthen the system. This work builds on prior ESIG work that Ryan was involved in as well. So just going to Ryan himself, our esteemed speaker. So Ryan is a senior analyst at Telos Energy and has experience in fundamental power market modeling, resource adequacy and resilience analysis, and settling transmission planning. At Telos Energy, he has worked on projects ranging from multi-value transmission planning, wide area reliability assessments, clean electricity planning, long duration energy storage assessments, and aiding stakeholders during IRP processes, including providing expert witness testimony. Ryan, we're very glad to have you on this webinar, and I'll turn it over to you now.
All right, thanks, James. And before I share my screen, I got to give the disclaimer that the picture is in need of update. That's got to be almost a decade old. And maybe that's the industry standard, as to have your picture for 10 years and then change it. Let's make sure you can see. I'm sharing my screen. Can you confirm that you can see that, James?
I can see Ryan.
Great, thank you. All right, thanks for joining me today, everybody. Really pleased to be sharing results from our report that's forthcoming. Should be out in a couple of days on developing stress testing methods, really walking through some principles that we put together as part of the ESIG Transmission Resilience Task Force. And this is really an overview of those methods, as well as this case study that we performed, which was on the SPP, the Southwest Power Pool system. So shout out to the Southwest Power Pool folks for being open and willing to share a lot of data with us that we can use to perform these types of analyses. And we hope that it's beneficial for them as well as everyone else tuning in today and checking out that material once it's released. So I'm going to be taking you through our study motivations and key findings, and then through the setup that we took to develop stress tests and walk through some of the key results, really with that lens around evaluating the role of interregional transmission when we're modeling these extreme events. Like everyone said, we're going to have some time for questions at the end, so hopefully we'll have a good discussion. So our motivations and key findings, was one of the high level slides summarizing everything we did. First, it was to develop approaches for stress testing to analyze system resilience against extreme events and also incorporate interregional transmission. To James's point earlier, we recognize that interregional transmission has a significant value when you look at historical events. And we wanted to have planning studies, a framework for planning studies that doesn't ignore that value and recognizes that, in particular, in these high impact, low frequency events, that interregional transmission can play an outsized role. The second motivation was to actually use the stress testing approach that we develop based on the first motivation on an actual system with planning data, in this case from Southwest Power Pool, so that we could evaluate those benefits. We could isolate the benefits of interregional transmission when we take our stress testing principles and put them into action. So we have 2 sets of content coming out. We'll have this webinar release, which shares the results of the case study in detail. We also have an accompanying PowerPoint deck with a lot of detail around the case study for those that are really inclined to get into the weeds of things and offer feedback if they so choose. And then we have a stress testing methods report where we get more into the different steps and principles that we developed while coming together in the task force. At a high level, stress testing principles, we've got creating realistic high impact scenarios using actual weather data, reflecting real world constraints, including interregional resource availability, not just the transfer capability. We want to model stressors on all types of resources and in a correlated fashion. When we're talking about why these studies matter and how they can be useful, I'll talk a little bit about it more, but if you're familiar with resource adequacy or probabilistic resource adequacy and multi-metrics, which ESIG has really pushed forward in the past several years, using stress testing and other types of analyses so that we can set like a maximum allowable threshold for those analyses is also valuable. So creating a feedback loop between those different planning practices. And then also thinking about stress testing as taking discrete events and being able to kind of use it as a sandbox to evaluate lots of types of mitigations in higher level detail. Not every solution is procure more capacity. It might be invest in regional transmission or some type of load control or a virtual power plant, right? Weatherization, testing those in a more discrete setting where you can mess around with those weather variables in more detail is we think valuable from this approach. I'm gonna skip the stress testing results because it'll be self-explanatory as we go through this. So I talked a lot about principles, and we got a really wordy title here, but it's meant so you can look back on this and read through and follow along if you don't have this webinar in front of you. So we thought about really 4 steps when it comes to stress testing and the process surrounding it. Really, step 1 is you're developing extreme events. I mentioned before, but we think that these extreme events, these scenarios, should be grounded in plausible multi-weather year sets of data. So we want to maintain weather correlation to maintain credibility. And I also think we should be open to using future climate change scenarios. There's some great data sets that have come out that try and produce, the hourly granular resolution for geography and time on different weather conditions over climate change scenarios. So you'll be open to that, expanding our toolbox. We should define these events clearly. If we have the data available, if we're recreating a historical event, or if we're taking different factors that have happened in the past or maybe could happen in the future, try and define where it lands in terms of risk level. How severe is the event that we're trying to simulate? And be transparent about that and why you're testing it. Step 2, model the interconnected grid. This one kind of speaks to James's point as well, where we should try and reflect the real world capabilities and constraints, economics, and interdependencies as much as possible. That's a fundamental pillar that we'll be talking about with our study, really how we decided to evaluate things for this case study. Assessing grid resilience. This pulls from a lot of the types of analyses you would see from resource adequacy, right? And this is meant to be a complementary analysis focused on the extreme events. But really, we need to go beyond peak hour thinking and think about multi-day, multi-hour types of events. And then creating actionable plans. Doing a study is great, but having it impact things in a positive way is always challenging. So we kind of outlined some steps as well in our report around defining risk thresholds and setting those standards in your planning criteria. Then, like I mentioned, evaluating a diverse set of mitigation options. So taking us through the wide area multi-day screening approach that we used. More details are going to be found in the report, just because we have limited time, and we took in a lot of both power system data and weather data and temperature data in particular, and we brought those together so that way we could develop a list of extreme weather and renewable risk events. We categorized them using statistical methods developed from, I believe it was Pacific Northwest National Lab, around energy droughts. We could bring those together and add a couple other variables and screen for region-wide and continent-wide weather events. We wanted to do this so that way we could have consistent weather correlated data across a large scale. So the continuous, or the continental United States is the region that we were looking at, with including SPP in detail. When you're doing these types of screening events, we should try and have as long of history as possible and be able to understand what tail risks might look like, so we can develop scenarios that are robust in regard to those. And like I mentioned, they should span at least hours and multiple days. I think there's a really good opportunity for stress testing, resilience planning in general, to connect with NERC TPL8 around extreme heat and cold weather events. This type of method is more akin to a resource adequacy, so folks familiar with that certainly would be familiar with some of the methods used here. But I would say that in transmission planning, that there could be opportunity for improvement and having those types of analyses talk to each other. So what did we do? We took what was 43 years of weather and power data, partly provided by SPP, and temperature data provided by, or made publicly available from PNNL, as well as historical generator outage data by large aggregated regions from NERC. We brought those together and we were able to screen for a set of extreme weather events. We categorized them as extreme cold, extreme heat, a wind drought, and a compound event, which is, low renewables, high forced outage risk, high demand. We brought all those together, or we screened through the weather and power system data in order to find just a set of events. These events that we have here are not exhaustive, but they do reflect some of the key risk periods that SPP identifies in their loss of load expectation reports. So we've got the summer of 2011 and of course, February of 2021 with Winter Storm Uri and a couple other high risk periods based on other factors like wind availability. You see September 2011 there. So one thing that I want to take a little second to talk about is these stress samples. So we identified these 4 periods and we're focused on just about a 2-week period for each of these. We wanted to have a multi-day period so we could capture fluctuations in things like battery storage level, but also the availability of imports and how those might change over time. So we could have just modeled a single event, right, exactly as it occurred in the past, and that would not be particularly helpful. So we're taking methods from probabilistic analysis, like resource adequacy analysis, which is modeling many continuous years of weather data, and we're applying similar principles to these discrete stress periods. Some differences that I want to highlight are for the renewable generation. Really what we did was we wanted to be able to evaluate for, let's say, an extreme cold event, some reasonable what if scenarios for different renewable generation levels. Not every extreme cold event has the exact same extreme cold weather that occurred in the past. And so we're taking the load and temperature data and looking at different renewable profiles in a similar category of day and modeling that over the same period. So instead of one extreme event and one renewable profile, we have 50 in this example. And we do a similar approach for temperature dependent or weather dependent forced outages. And the rest of these are randomized outages that are more standard modeling practice around thermal maintenance and transfer capability levels for DC ties in SPP. So we took the weather events, the 50 stress samples, and 2 load levels just to push the system even higher, kind of thinking about, what if your load growth is higher in the future with the same resource mix? What does that look like? And how resilient is your system to that change? So we took all those together in order for us to have 100 stress samples for each of these 4 events. Now, the modeling framework that we used to accomplish this, as we mentioned, interregional transmission was really one of the focuses around our case study. And we took a hybrid model. We took a detailed sub-regional SPP model where we're modeling generators at a unit level in each of these 6 sub-regions, 1 through 6 here. And we layer in here transfer capabilities from the NERC ITCS work, as well as from SPP LOLE study transfer capabilities. So each of these sub-regions has a capability into their subzone, which is SPP North and South. And then between SPP North and South, we have transfer capabilities both between those regions, marked by the yellow lines between the northern and southern regions on the map, as well as to external regions using similar topology to the ITCS. And then we model DC interfaces as well. Those are the blue lines. So we're trying to get granularity internal to SPP because that's our region of focus. Thinking from a planner perspective, we want to have as much detail as we can internally, and we want to adequately represent the external regions, which brings us to this second part of this formula here, where building on work previous ESIG work, we developed, we took the hourly energy margin approach that we developed a couple years back, where we're taking the weather correlated data sets for all of these other regions in gray, and we're stacking up their variables together and accounting for their weather dependent outages, storage net generation, what their load is on a future system, all taking this out to about the 2030 timeframe. And that gives us an approximation of the external resource availability, and it fluctuates by hour based on your wind, your solar, your thermal availability, and your load. And that lets us model SPP in detail with transfer capabilities and external regions modeled with the hourly energy margin. Taking us through our actual study where we wanted to isolate the value of interregional transmission during those stress testing events, we modeled SPP in 3 representations: an island, which is no imports, just internal; firm net import generators only. We modeled the level of availability based on SPP's LOLE model, where they have a certain megawatt value for net imports into each of the subregions. And then we took our full model approach, where we modeled the capabilities and the resource availability. So there are different reasons that you might take these approaches, and we really wanted to isolate how stress testing results look when you take these different approaches. All right, gonna get into some of our results. For our extreme cold event is coming up first. Like I mentioned, this event is very much so a resimulation of Winter Storm Uri. So these are our baseline weather variables. We've got significant amounts of significant load levels, very high winter load in this future system, over 50 gigawatts, pretty high net load where renewables are low and temperatures are very low. So that has a high force outage risk. When we take our interregional transmission full modeling topology, we take all 50 of these unique samples across our 2 load levels, where we have the forecasted load, or the projected load rather, and then the plus 10%. We modeled the entire continental United States, and we took note of periods where we had low energy availability within SPP, and we wanted to isolate and look at what were the imports in that period. So during that, we've got these top 2 charts, which are the reference load and the 10% higher load in orange. Each of these shows the hourly energy margin within SPP. So it's really a measure of risk. As you get into a lower margin, these are decimal percentage points. So you get below a 10% level, we kind of determine that you're in a higher risk zone. Certainly there's some buffer below 10%, but relative to that hourly demand, there's higher risk. As you might expect, when the load is higher, that buffer is lower as well. And then the bottom 2 charts are the net interchange. So a negative value is SPP being a net importer relative to the entire system. So north and south combined. So there's many periods and hours when SPP in this future system, now it's a future approximately 2030 system. So the resource mix is different than today, but you have periods of exports and periods of pretty significant imports. The thing I want to highlight here is that in these samples, in particular, like down here at the bottom, we're getting almost 8 gigawatts, or a little bit more than 8 gigawatts of imports in some of these hours. And when we look at the different modeling assumptions between the island and the firm import and the modeling neighbors assumptions, you see that if you omit or don't represent that interregional transfer capability, the risk on the system is much larger. It's not that there's no risk. You have a lot of imports, but the value that you're getting out of interregional transmission isn't being represented as fully, which might hinder the ability to expand that and improve system resilience in general. Putting a finer point on that, I've got here 2 charts. Again, it's the reference load and the plus 10% load. We've got the number of unserved energy events that are occurring in all 50 of our or all 100 of our samples for this event. So we've got 50 for the reference load and 50 for the plus 10% load. We see in our reference case, based on this future system, we have no unserved energy events when we model our neighbors with our transfer capability included. But when we pare back that representation, we start seeing unserved energy risks occurring. When we bump that load up higher to that 10% level, we actually do start seeing that you're kind of tapping out either the existing availability of external resources, or you're tapping out the transfer capability into SPP. So the green dots there are a little hard to see, so I put in some markers. You can see you actually start getting an unserved energy event. If you don't include the modeling neighbors and you're just looking at firm imports only, or the island, your events are much more drastic and much more severe. The point we're trying to make here is that the resilience of the system in these discrete events is quite improved when you account for existing transfer capability, which offers an opportunity to consider additional interregional transmission. putting it another way, how we model external assistance and interregional transmission, it has a large influence in determining how resilient a system is. So you can see here, this is just the total count of unserved energy events in this winter event. The light blue bars are for the reference load, and the dark blue bars are for the higher 10% higher load case. So out of 50 samples, there's 13 events in the island reference load, but in the plus 10% higher case, there's 66 unique events. As we can see here, there's a pretty big difference between the three different topologies, and we wanted to highlight that with this method and show we can track the benefits of interregional transmission in a pretty complicated planning model setting. Moving us through so we can have some time for questions. I've got the extreme heat event, a similar layout here for you to look back on if you so choose, just to give you some details around the type of event we're modeling. So we're modeling a slightly longer period here. This is July 27th through August 4th, 2011 weather are shown here. We model a slightly longer period than that to get some more of the risk dynamics around the high temperatures that occurred in that summer. So high net load periods as well. A lot more periods of low margin or high risk that are showing up here as SPP in this example. In the reference load, it's not really importing during this extreme event, but what it is doing is it's exporting a decent amount. And part of that comes from the resource mix being different in this future system than it is today. Maybe it happens, maybe it doesn't happen, but there's a lot more solar in this case. You can look at this larger slide deck and see some of the assumptions on resource mix, but there's a lot more solar assumed. And this is a summer event. But when you have that higher load level, you can see that even though we weren't really importing much during the initial reference load cases, you start seeing more imports pop up, and certainly a lot of periods where that margin is pretty tight. So you're not relying on imports, you're not shedding load, but your margin gets pretty low. And that's where you see some of these higher import levels coming into play. So when we look at this unserved energy chart again, we see in our reference load no risk in this future scenario based on the 50 samples that we modeled. But we do see in the higher load case quite a lot more events occurring, which points to that even though in the reference load things looked okay, we're really on the edge, right? There's not much that could go wrong without having things be a whole lot tighter. And that's where you see the difference between these modeling scenarios around transfer capability. So when you have firm import only and island representation, you're really discounting this value you have of interregional transmission. We weren't having, if I go back a slide, as deep of imports, about 6,600 megawatts, whereas we were looking at 8 gigs or 8,200 megawatts in the winter event. And it's occurring, relatively infrequently. But here we can see the difference in our unserved energy events for this summer event. So when we think about resource adequacy analyses and the assumptions we make there, different events might have a different risk profile based on how we're modeling interregional transmission, how we're modeling external resources, and tracking their availability in detail really does change how the event looks in terms of its extreme event. Now, this summer event had a lot better, or had much better outage, or sorry, had less outages than the extreme cold event. There's a higher degree of uncertainty and a higher magnitude of risk around high thermal forced outages in the summer, but there's low wind availability in the summer typically. So different types of risk for different events. Moving on to our wind drought event. Again, a similar setup for these slides where I'm showing you the hourly load, the hourly net load, and then the temperature in this initial setup. Really want to highlight here that there are periods where load is decently high in the case. You can definitely see that in that September later part in the chart, like getting up above 50 gigawatts. Again, it's a future SPP system. But lots of a period of extended multi-day high net load exhibited by low wind, which dominates SPP in terms of renewable generation. So we wanted to evaluate the risks here based on the future system and interregional transmission. So this is modeling the system again with the full transfer capability, looking at the hourly energy margins within the detailed SPP model, and then looking at the net interchange with its neighbors. So we can see here that in our reference load case, not a whole lot of risk when it comes to this wind drought period. Now, when we think about the system that SPP has in 2030 timeframe, there's still a substantial amount of thermal generation in that system, and that might not change. But if it does change, this type of wind drought event could become more severe. That's why I think it's important. We looked at one snapshot, but you could extend this method to looking at future snapshots of like resource mix years and be able to evaluate, does that stress event look as stressful as it did in the past with my changed resource mix? That's why we think having a selection of events is valuable, and maybe maintaining those events throughout different study years is also a beneficial approach. When we bump up the load case, we do see that we start having some net import needs popping up. So if load is higher and you have a similar resource mix during this type of event, how you model transmission, interregional transmission, changes that risk profile. Here we see a similar chart to the summer 2011 event or period, where as we bump up the load, we start seeing these unserved energy events pop up where their magnitude in terms of total megawatt hours shed in the model, and their duration is more severe in an island sense, less severe when you model firm imports. And in this example, there's plenty of support available at a modest level from neighbors during this type of wind drought event. So it's important to understand that where those types of benefits come from, and which regions are able to support and which regions are not able to support during different types of events, which we'll get to in just a second. I think I'm good on time. So similar chart where we're looking at the number of unserved energy events in this stress test. So we've got our 50 samples for the reference load and for the 10% higher load, 100 total. Overall, a less severe event than the winter and the summer when we're looking at any of the topologies. And really that's coming down to the load levels. Load drives a lot of risk. It might be obvious. But it also has to do with the type of resource mix that we're modeling. So it's, like I mentioned, still plenty of thermal capacity, plenty of dispatchable capacity, not a whole lot of battery storage on the system in this projected future. But when we add in modeling transfer capabilities in a higher level of detail, we see that those events, the system's resilient to this event. So, like I mentioned, a summary of how interregional transmission supports SPP in stress tests, specifically in the ones that we modeled. Touching on the cold event, the heat event, and the wind drought, we can see these bar charts show us the percentage of net imports, or the percentage of imports across our samples from each of the sending regions. So if we look at SPP, we've got its neighbors with ERCOT, Front Range, which is the topology used in the NERC ITCS. We've got MISO South, MISO West, CERC Central, and Wasatch Front. Wasatch and Front Range are both in WEC. We can see that in the cold event, imports are really coming predominantly from MISO South and MISO West, a little bit from Front Range, a little bit from CERC and Wasatch, also some from ERCOT, which, we're looking at a multi-day period. Not every day in that period is the most extreme in ERCOT as it is in other regions. Also, we're looking at a future resource mix. So when we're thinking about, was the system as at risk in the past as it is in the future, or rather is the future risk the same as the past risk? We're looking at different resource mixes and a future timeline. So in this event, we are seeing a little bit of support coming from ERCOT, although a majority of it's coming from MISO and from WEC. In the heat event, things switch up a little bit. As I mentioned, a whole lot of solar in ERCOT and Front Range battery storage as well is being deployed in these regions and these future systems. You see that during the heat event, SPP is getting support predominantly from Front Range and ERCOT. So really what I see here is some solar heavy systems when we think about future expectations. The wind drought is coming from ERCOT and Front Range. One thing I want to mention when we think about these imports is we weight all the external regions at the same level. So if they, or sorry, we weight them all using a scarcity curve. So if ERCOT is really scarce, its energy prices will be really high, just like Circ Centrals. And the relative level of scarcity will impact whether imports go from that region to SPP, or whether SPP, if it has availability, will export to those regions. So we're really trying to look at scarcity levels, like what regions have availability during which hours, and is that available for SPP or vice versa. When we bump up that load, and I'll flip back for a second because these are the same events, and we tried to make it so you could kind of see when we bump up the load, so the risk in the system is greater, we can see that the proportion of support diversifies. That's a combination of tapping out existing transfer capability between regions, but also tapping out their resource availability. So modeling that dynamically and being able to see how much that support exists, how deep that reservoir is, maybe is a good way to put it, is part of the stress testing approach. We want to be cognizant of the risks while also recognizing the value of interregional transmission. And I think that is both an improvement and also represents a risk for taking this modeling approach, is that your assumptions on resource import availability using some firm assumptions might be not as strong in the future, might be not as good in the future, where you have hours that you are below that level, but hours where you're far above that level, when we think about the differences between how you represent import capabilities in your stress testing models or just in your planning models in general. Some key findings. Maybe this is self-explanatory from this conversation so far, but external assistance and interregional transmission is important for modeling stress events. We modeled some of the most extreme events that SPP has in its resource adequacy data set, using some of the most extreme generator outage levels, particularly for the winter event, that were available from the historical record. And we think about Uri outages, something like 30 to 40% of megawatts on outage. And when you model different interregional transmission representations, the system looks much more resilient, even though there's still risk. It's about unlocking that value, unlocking that resilience value, and showing how when we isolate it, we can prove out that value. Stress testing lets you evaluate those outlier events in more detail. So we took just 4 events and we really ran them through a bunch of different combinations of risk factors, while trying to maintain the weather correlation between the different types of temperature, wind, solar, load, generator outage, and some randomized effects as well when we think about like DC tie outages or maintenance periods. We think that digging deeper into the events that drive reserve margin levels and capacity needs is warranted. Probabilistic resource adequacy analysis, which is, I mentioned, is complementary to this. It tends to look at a lot of cases, which is great, and it gives us some confidence in the probability of events occurring. But we also think diving deeper into the specific events that drive risk the most is valuable, and that's where this approach is useful. Also, evaluating different renewable profiles for different events can expand risk analysis. Certainly, there's a correlation between weather and load that we want to maintain. And we did that by maintaining the weather and load correlation, but then grabbing different similar load days and grabbing different renewable profiles to match on to our extreme event. There's limited weather data available, and so people take different approaches to this. We resampled different days. Others do day shifting, but we think that having your single stress event modeled against multiple different types of weather realistic profiles for wind and solar and other types of variable resources is valuable and shouldn't be omitted. Lastly, future stress testing work. As with all things, more could be done. So we think external assistance and interregional transfer capabilities could be improved for modeling them. More power flow modeling in general, I believe, is needed when it comes to what is the transfer capability under a variety of system conditions. So the NERC ITCF set a great foundation for your typical winter and summer peaks, but there are other types of events where you might have different transfer capabilities or different types of risks, particularly when we think about generator outages. How do those change our transfer capabilities, and can we get those in these types of models? Reflecting firm contracts also would be beneficial, and having a little bit more detail on the transmission topology with a nodal or some sort of hybrid nodal detail, maybe within SPP and maybe within the nearest neighbors might be beneficial, even though that would also increase the workload. To how you develop the events, we looked at temperature and wind and some compound factors here, but there's other types of extreme events that we didn't really factor, and you might find valuable depending on the risk profile of your region. That's wind chill, precipitation, gas production declines, which would be, connected to the former. Tornadoes, though, hurricanes, wildfires, right? Like, we didn't assess those, but those would be valuable in the stress testing framework. And leveraging synthetic data or climate change data, I think is something we wish we could have done and something we would look forward to doing. And then taking this framework and being able to throw in different types of solutions, different type of mitigations, and consider how some benefits might have a low average, some solutions might have a low average benefit, like winterization, where it's not often that cold and you don't really see that benefit, but have an extreme outlier benefit. During extreme events, that benefit might provide a lot of value. So whether you can monetize that effectively in your current processes, or it's just good to quantify it, stress testing can be used to do that and do a variety of different resources and solutions, including interregional transmission. That is where we'll leave things off. Opening it up to questions, pass it back to James quick so we can maybe touch on some of the Slido stuff.
All right, thank you, Ryan. Thank you for that great presentation on the work that we've done over the last year or so. I thought I would have to seed the questions, but it looks like every 10th person on the call is asking a question. We have almost 30 questions here for you. So we'll get through as many as we can now, but a reminder that Ryan will go through the unanswered questions and respond to them, and we'll send an email out. So first off, the recording and the slide deck will be made available shortly after the call, maybe in a couple of days here. So Ryan, going straight off of some of the recommendations that you have, right? If you think about the actual events that we've experienced, thinking about the last couple of weeks or the last couple of years, as you think through, as you describe in the report, some of the best practices that you're looking at from different regions. So if a region could change one thing this year to improve stress testing, right, what would that highest value step be? Is it on the fidelity of the modeling, right, both in the transmission and the generation? Is it looking at the weather and the diversity of weather conditions? Is it being creative in what the stress periods are? Or is it, yeah, actually do some stress testing, right? Because we realize that not many people do stress testing. I'm sorry to seed the question there, but if a region could change one thing today, this year,
Yeah,
what would be the highest value thing?
it's a good question. I will actually give two answers though, even though it's just what's the one thing. So the first is model interregional transfer capabilities. I know folks planning regions and utilities, they can do these studies and they have done them. Some regions are a little bit ahead of the curve than others. Model the capability, right? The actual transfer capability, but also model the variability in the resources in a weather correlated, time synchronized fashion. One thing I really like that we did in our study, it's challenging to do, but it's also trying to create weather-informed renewable profiles that vary within our stress test as well. Like I mentioned, that could be done by shifting days. It also could be done like something we did, which was doing like a similar load sampling within the same month. So you've got your top load day and then your second top load day. What if I switch the renewable profiles for those days? I think you want to have a careful lens when you take those approaches, but both of those I think would be really beneficial. Grounding things in either some other supplementary analysis, like a weather analysis, to make sure that things are realistic, or a power flow analysis, like the transfer capabilities, to make sure we're representing the network capability well. I think those are probably the two most valuable things, and I haven't seen that in all of the stress testing examples that we looked at. Some of them do include some considerations, though.
Great, thank you. And we'll come back to that question on models and modeling, but let's deal with a quick clarification question here. So when you talk about tail risks, how are you defining them in practice, right? What makes an event stress test worthy versus just another event?
That's a good question. Well, the approach that we took was to take our set of hourly power system and weather data and apply some standardized indices against them, so that we could characterize a little bit what the risk was. So just to walk through it quickly, you might have different values for these, but we took a 10th percentile risk. So anything below 10th percentile when it comes to wind generation, solar generation, and your outage, your available thermal megawatts. And then we took the 90th percentile when we looked at load. So anything above the 90th percentile. So that gives you a lot of days, a lot of hours to look through. And then we can group those together and see, am I getting coincident factors? Am I getting high or low wind, low solar, and high load? Am I getting high thermal outages coincident with that? So I'm going to flash something up on the screen real quick, just to give a sense for. This is from the slide deck that I didn't share today, just for time's sake. But I really think while we're taking discrete events and modeling them, it's good to highlight where on your historical data those events land. I think this is effective for communicating to people as well. So we modeled four events, and within those four events, we have temperatures in these red shaded regions, and the temperature distribution that we have data from. The wind capacity factor is similar, and this is gas fleet outage, right? So we're looking at these extreme events. So it's a little bit hard to describe, but I think looking at some percentiles of the available data that you do have is a great way to start. And then crafting those stress tests to give you some unique events that might be further out on the tail, but still be informed by weather, and being able to match them to some actual historical data and be like, yeah, we're hitting these tail risks, but we're getting new unique tail risks that are still reasonable for us to evaluate.
Thanks, Ryan. So going to the question about the tool. So there's a couple different components in this modeling and analysis, right? Looking at the transfer capability themselves, and then looking at the chronological weather correlated modeling that you're doing. So what type of tools did you use for the analysis? I'll talk more broadly about type of tools. And then the actual question was, what specific model and tool did you use?
Well, I think you could accomplish this with a lot of tools out there. Really what you need is some foundational weather data sets. So thankfully for us, SPP shared us their power system, their weather informed power system data set that they use in their resource adequacy models. Although you could create that using any of the available data sources that are out there. We've got historical hourly loads. We've got synthetic weather data from NLR and from the Wind Toolkit, NSRDB. And then we've got, thankfully, some transfer capability values from the NERC ITCS, which used AC power flow tools. Tara, in particular, is what they use to do transfer capabilities, both like a region to region and simultaneous import limits. Like I mentioned, it'd be nice to expand the analysis to look at transfer capabilities during stress events that go beyond, winter and summer peak load conditions. I think that would be a valuable improvement. So really you need some weather data that you can feed into an hourly unit commitment model. So I used Plexos for this, but it is not unique to Plexos. Any model where you can represent hourly availability and dynamic risks, I think would be useful for this, including battery storage, charging and discharging. Certainly it's nice to be able to influence how the markets dispatch. So I used like a scarcity modeling approach for the regions outside of SPP, where as they approached their reserve level, their minimum reserve level, the prices go up across the entire region. So it disincentivizes exports, which you might see in an actual market. And then, yeah, I guess I mentioned the foundational weather data sets, being able to link those together for the screening to identify unique periods or interesting periods, I think is valuable. And there's a lot of historical data for that. And PNNL honestly has a lot of good data for the 1980 to 2019 period that I link in the report as well. Happy to send that to you too in the questions.
Thanks. You are touching on many of the other questions. I am trying to be as democratic as possible in what people have voted on, and so there's still a chance if you could please go to Slido and vote on a question. We have a couple minutes here, but even when we're responding to the questions, it's good to know where people have the kind of the most interest. Um, so we'll touch on a couple more of those. So let's um, go off of kind of the improvements question and frame just slightly differently. So what planning blind spot do you see most often? Is it correlated outages, right? Is there a big gap there? Is it load and weather coincidence? Is it on undervaluing interregional support? And that's both looking at the availability of resources in other areas and the actual transfer capability. Right? What do you see as the biggest blind spot when we're thinking about this
Yeah,
particular topic?
gosh, I might get myself into trouble, James, but I think that there's a big blind spot and uncomfortability with even including non-firm transfer capability or resource availability in stress testing or in resource adequacy modeling in general. Now, maybe that's because my entire study we just shared was about interregional transmission. I think that's a blind spot, which is why we illustrated our study the way we did. It's particularly important when we think about how much value are we actually giving ourselves for the investment that we've already put into the system, and then what's the best investment for the future. There's a lot of risks that are being highlighted for the future, and one of the most beneficial things when we consider tail risks is interregional transmission. I think another aspect that I personally would love to drill more into is the variability in renewable profiles. I'll shout out to Chris Dent because I really liked what he said at this one conference. Is that plus or minus 3 days, maybe the solar and the wind data could be shifted around a little bit to give you more variability to expand our planning data sets to also expand our risk profile without breaking the valuable weather correlation. And I would love to see more of that, and I would love to see that be done in a transparent fashion. I just think we're limited with the weather data that we have available and the weather data sets that we're using, and people are trying to improve them a lot. And that might be a planning gap when we consider unknown risks and unknown tail risks in the future.
Thanks, Ryan. Talking about the weather. Um, so your framework leans on this multi-year weather correlated data. What would you say is the minimum data set to do this credibly? And if we do use shortcuts, what are the pitfalls? What is the risk there, and how can we mislead with those findings?
Well, I'll start with the second part, which sometimes, for the sake of simplicity, we craft what my boss Derek says are doomsday scenarios. You know, a doomsday scenario where everything bad hits all at once, it can happen, of course. But if we only look at that, is that reflective of the varying types of conditions that might occur in these events? And if those doomsday scenarios reflect actual weather conditions and how they line up, that's valuable. But creating a scenario that doesn't reflect the weather conditions or hasn't really occurred, I think poses a risk. Not misleading, just maybe an uninformed view of the types of risks. We want to evaluate risks as they might unfold in a as realistic fashion as possible. And that would let us pick economic and affordable solutions to that. And when we talk about the weather data and the minimum number of years, I mean, I don't I don't know if there's a perfect number of weather years. I think more is better, but you also get worse and worse data resolution the further out you go. And if you go into the future, I mean, that's as bad of data resolution as you can get, I think. Um, so there's challenges to that. We, like for myself, I think expanding that weather correlated data to be, you know, your 2000 to 2024, 2025, if it's available data would be great. And then trying to get back into those extreme cold weather events that occurred in like the early 90s and then also the 1980s, I think is valuable as well. Some people go much further back. EPRI goes back to like the 50s if it's available. Some folks go back to the 1800s if they have that data. Um, but I think having a targeted amount of variability where you're like, okay, I'm capturing this distribution within a reasonable degree, I think is most valuable. And then you can take some of the approaches that we used here and others use to give you more variability by resampling data and creating realistic what if scenarios or shifting days just by 1 or 2 days, maybe 3 days, to give variability on the timing of of really renewable generation, I think could help expand those data sets. Just caveating that and understanding that that's what you're doing, being transparent about it, I think is very valuable as well. So that was a non-answer, James. I'm sorry. There's no magic number of weather years. Let's just say it's more than 10.
Well, we'll let you think about it, and you can respond in writing when you've had some time and are not on the spot.
Okay.
We have 3 minutes left, and I'll ask one question because I think it's important clarification. Um, have you examined? I'm hoping you can answer this in 1 minute or less, Ryan. Have you examined the correlation between SPP and MISO cold events, given that 70% of the imports were from MISO during the cold events, kind of maybe both modeled and actual? Yeah, how did you look at the correlation between SPP and its neighbors?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. All of the correlation, it's embedded in our model. So when we're resampling data, well, if we take the base data, of course, it's correlated with the other regions because it's as the weather progressed. And when we create those stress variables where we're creating new types of renewable and outage profiles that are weather dependent, we're taking that same sample period. So let's say August 1st, 2011. We're taking that day, finding similar load days, and matching them across our entire data set. So we're grabbing it from New England all the way to Southern California, the same data. So that way, within those days that we're resampling for our stress test, the weather correlations are embedded in them. So then the availability of resources is coming from different outage risk profiles, maybe the different temperature profile over the event, right? Because we're doing multi-day periods. You know, the events would start in SPP and go down across the country. Or for a heat wave, it might be settled in there, but in the northern part, maybe not the southern part of the country. And that's really where we're starting to see some regions when you bump up the load. You know, there are weather correlated risks in them and the distribution of support, it starts to shift. And lastly, the resource mix is going to be different in the different regions. I would say I mean, I guess I could pull it back up. but maybe I shouldn't because I have 1 minute left. MISO has more. I would hazard, although I have to refresh my memory. MISO South has a decent amount of solar resource in the summertime compared to SPP, and same with ERCOT, right? When we think about that heat event, and that might be different and supportive during winter in the middle of the day, obviously not at night.
All right. All right. Thank you so much, Ryan. We are at the top of the hour here. Again, thank you, Ryan, for leading this work, and your colleagues at Telos, and the task force that was behind this work over the last year or so. Like Ryan said, the report should be coming out fairly soon, and you'll get notification when that is available. Before we wrap up, I just want to do a quick plug for a few upcoming ESIG events. So we have another webinar on February 11th on integrating large loads, looking at the interconnection, performance requirements, and modeling. And then the following week, either be the 24th or the 26th, we'll confirm that, is another webinar on integrating large loads into resource adequacy planning. And then lastly, our spring technical workshop in Tucson will start March 16th. And we're hoping that you can join us for that. Details and registration are on our ESIG's event page. Again, thank you all so very much for joining us for this discussion. We hope that you can join us for future events. Thank you. Have a good rest of your week.